The ocean had taken 14 days to cross. 14 days in the belly of a ship that rolled and pitched through Atlantic swells. 14 days for Unteroffizier Hermann Böttcher to imagine what waited on the other side. He'd been told America was weak, divided, crumbling, under the weight of its own corruption. He gripped the railing as the gangplank swayed beneath his boots. June 4th, 1943, Norfolk, Virginia, enemy territory. And through the morning fog rolling off the harbor, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. The propaganda had lied. White dock workers moved alongside black Americans, not separated, not at gunpoint, just working, operating machinery that looked like it belonged in a science fiction novel. Cranes lifting cargo that would take 100 men back home. Women in coveralls. Guided steel beams through the air with hand. Signals. Confident. Efficient. In control. Children hawked newspapers at the gates. Laughing. Playing. Nobody ran at the sight of German uniforms. Böttcher leaned toward the man behind him. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Die Amerikaner sind verrückt. The Americans are crazy. He couldn't have known it then, but that whisper would echo through history. Through the pages of his memoir, published in Germany 9 years later. Through thousands of letters that would cross the ocean in reverse. Through the lives of men who came as enemies and left as something else entirely. The base stretched out before them like a vision from another world. 4,300 acres of docks and warehouses and machinery, cranes working in perfect rhythm, dozens of ships being loaded and unloaded simultaneously. In one morning, this single port moved more tonnage than Hamburg handled in a week. But that wasn't what stopped the prisoners in their tracks. It was the normalcy, civilians wandering near military installations, not fleeing, not cowering, just there. Vendors selling coffee and donuts within sight of warships preparing for war. A brass band playing swing music at a nearby rally. The notes drifting across the water like they had nowhere better to be. 2,500 men of Rommel's Africa Corps stood in formation on American soil. The first wave of what would become nearly 500,000 German prisoners scattered across the United States by the time the war ended. They'd expected camps, brutality, the same treatment Germany gave its enemies. What they got instead would haunt them far more than any beating ever could. They came expecting to find a nation at war. Instead, they found a country that refused to stop being itself. The processing began immediately, and with it, the first impossibility. German military doctrine was simple. Prisoners were either useful or they were burdens. The Geneva Convention was something you acknowledged when it suited you, ignored when it didn't. But here, American officers were reading them their rights. In fluent German, asking about dietary restrictions, medical needs, religious requirements. One prisoner watched as a sergeant with a clearly Jewish name distributed Red Cross packages, explained in careful German that kosher meals were available if needed. Several men laughed nervously. They thought it was mockery, some cruel joke before the real treatment began. It wasn't a joke. The American military had actually prepared for the religious dietary needs of enemies who'd been hunting their people across Europe. The medical inspections defied everything they understood about warfare. German soldiers with wounds, men who'd been shooting at American convoys weeks earlier, received penicillin, that miracle drug barely available even to Wehrmacht field hospitals. The same medicine American boys got. A Swiss Red Cross inspector would write in his July report, medical treatment provided to German prisoners equals or exceeds that given to American military personnel. The prisoners thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. At one point during the processing, a black medical technician drew blood from Wehrmacht officers for routine health screening. Back home, such racial contact would be legally forbidden, a crime punishable by death. Here, it was standard procedure. Nobody even blinked. But the mess hall, that's where reality truly started to crack. They were led into a facility where American sailors were already eating. Enemies who'd been trying to sink each other's ships in the Atlantic, sitting in the same room, using the same food lines, eating the same quality meals. The Americans barely looked up. They were more interested in a baseball game crackling through a radio than in the Germans sitting 50 feet away. One prisoner stared at his tray. Real meat, fresh bread, vegetables that hadn't been frozen or canned for months. He'd been prepared for starvation, for beatings, for the kind of treatment Germany handed out. Instead, he got 3 hot meals and Americans who couldn't care less that he was the enemy. The dissonance was almost physical, like trying to hold 2 opposite truths in your mind at once. The train journey west felt like falling through layers of illusion. They weren't transported in boxcars. They rode in actual passenger coaches, cushioned seats, windows you could see through. The trains stopped at regular stations, and at every stop, civilians gathered to watch. At Union Station in Washington, hundreds of people milled around the platforms. German prisoners watched through the windows as American families said goodbye to soldiers heading off to training camps. Wives kissing husbands in public, children waving flags, teenagers sharing milkshakes at the station restaurant. Enemies and families occupied the same platform, separated only by glass and a handful of guards who seemed more interested in directing traffic than watching prisoners. The trains rolled through industrial areas that should have been hidden, camouflaged, protected. Instead, factories advertised themselves with massive letters. The Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Plant in Baltimore had a parking lot visible from the tracks, full of workers' personal automobiles. Not army trucks, private cars. The prisoners could count B-26 bombers lined up for delivery. Row after row, no attempt at concealment, no paranoia. Just American industry operating in plain sight of enemies who'd been trying to destroy it. Through Pennsylvania, the countryside glowed orange at night. Blast furnaces running continuous shifts, steel mills that never stopped, coal mines feeding the hunger of a nation that seemed to have no limits. Workers lived in actual houses, not barracks, individual homes with gardens and electric lights in every window, radio antennas on every roof. At a stop in Harrisburg, German officers watched the shift change at a nearby factory. Men carrying lunchboxes, wearing leather shoes, wristwatches on their wrists, climbing into personal vehicles. One worker tossed away a half-eaten apple, opened his lunchbox and pulled out a fresh one. Hermann Böttcher watched this happen. Watched a laborer throw away food, and something inside him began to break. Back home, men were fighting over scraps. Here, workers were so well fed, they could afford to be wasteful. Camp Hearn, Texas, December 1942. 720 acres in Robertson County, built to house 4,800 German prisoners in conditions that would exceed what most of them knew as civilians. The barracks had electric lights, not oil lamps, electricity, indoor plumbing with hot water heaters, flush toilets in every building, individual beds with actual mattresses, sheets, blankets, not straw pallets on dirt floors, recreation halls with ping-pong tables, musical instruments, libraries stocked with books. A Swiss inspector would note in his August 1943 report that conditions at Camp Hearn exceeded Geneva Convention requirements and surpassed the living conditions many of these men had known in peacetime. Germany, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Sykes addressed the arriving prisoners in fluent German. He'd studied the language at university before the war. He explained the rules, but then he said something that made no sense whatsoever. The prisoners would govern themselves within the compounds. They'd elect spokesmen, organize their own activities, manage their own schedules. Self-governance for enemies. It was either weakness or a trap. There was no third option. The camp hospital contained equipment many German civilian hospitals had never seen: X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that included the new wonder drug everyone was talking about. When a prisoner named Georg Gärtner developed appendicitis in September 1943, he received surgery within hours, performed by an army surgeon from Dallas, with German POW medical staff assisting. He woke up in a clean bed with real painkillers. Not dead, not left to suffer, treated like he mattered. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for the canteen, a store where prisoners could purchase goods with scrip they earned from voluntary labor. Cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing materials, musical instruments, art supplies. The idea that enemy prisoners could shop, could choose, could have luxuries beyond basic survival. It scrambled every wire in their military minds. By September, severe labor shortages meant prisoners could work outside the camps. Throughout Texas, German POWs found themselves employed in agriculture and non-military industries. They earned 80 cents per day, the same base pay as American privates. At the King Ranch near Kingsville, they encountered American agriculture on a scale that defied comprehension: 825,000 acres, larger than Rhode Island. German prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros, some black ranch hands. The racial mixing contradicted every Nazi theory about hierarchy and purity. But what really stunned them was the mechanization. A single combine harvester replaced dozens of workers. Trucks, not horse-drawn wagons, moved crops. The ranch even used aircraft, small civilian planes, to survey cattle herds. The foreman, Richard Kleberg Jr., treated German POWs like temporary employees, not enemies, just workers. At cotton gins throughout the region, they witnessed processing speeds that seemed impossible. The Hearn cotton oil mill processed more cotton in a single day than German textile mills handled in a month. Yet workers took regular breaks, ate full lunches, listened to radios while working. Productivity through good treatment, not through fear. The concept was revolutionary. What broke their minds even further was the politics. FBI monitoring reports would later reveal that German POWs were shocked to hear American farmers openly criticizing Roosevelt, complaining about government policies without fear of arrest. At one farm near Bryan, a farmer told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over crop allocation disputes. The farmer faced no consequences. Such defiance would mean death back home. Here it was just Tuesday in December 1943, the town of Hearn did something incomprehensible. They gave their enemies Christmas. The entire town, population 2,000, mobilized to ensure German prisoners had a proper celebration. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Local churches collected 4,800 individual gift packages, one for every prisoner. Schools contributed handmade cards, decorations. The American Legion Post 164, veterans who'd fought Germans in the First War, donated cigarettes and candy and sports equipment to current German enemies. The Lions Club provided musical instruments. The Garden Club decorated the camp with holly and evergreen boughs. A 30-foot Christmas tree stood in the main compound, decorated with electric lights that burned continuously, using more electricity than entire German villages had for all purposes. Local church choirs learned German Christmas. Carols, phonetically, performed. Concerts for prisoners in their native language. Mrs. Sarah Patterson directed the Methodist choir. Her son was fighting in Italy at that very moment. She stood in front of German soldiers and sang them songs of peace. several prisoners broke down crying. The cognitive dissonance was too much. Their minds couldn't reconcile the kindness with the reality of war. The Christmas feast menu read like fantasy. Roast turkey, a full pound per man. Ham, candied sweet potatoes. Green beans, cornbread stuffing. Cranberry sauce, mince pie, apple pie. Ice cream, beer for enlisted men. California wine for officers, approximately 5,000 calories per person. Back home, German civilians were getting 1,200 calories a day, when rations were available at all. Working in Texas exposed the prisoners to America's racial contradictions, and those contradictions were more complex than any propaganda could capture. Black soldiers from the 359th Infantry Regiment occasionally served guard duty at Camp Herne. German POWs, raised on Nazi racial ideology, found themselves taking orders from Black Americans. Some requested transfers, refused to submit to what they'd been taught was an inferior race. Their requests were denied. But here's where it got strange. Those same German prisoners could eat in Herne restaurants that refused to serve the black soldiers guarding them, could attend movie theaters where their guards couldn't, sit in the main section. German enemies had more social freedom than American citizens who happened to be black. The paradox was impossible to ignore. At work sites, prisoners labored alongside Mexican-American and black workers. The efficiency of these mixed-race crews, when focused on tasks rather than skin color, challenged every Nazi theory about racial purity equaling productivity. German POWs picked cotton alongside black workers who consistently outperformed them. The master race kept getting shown up. The transformation happened slowly. Then, all at once, Hermann Böttcher arrived at Camp Herne in June 1943 as a convinced Nazi. He would write later about the gradual collapse of his ideology. Death by 1,000 small observations. The turning point came that Christmas, when Herne citizens gave presents to enemy prisoners. He wrote in his memoir, "These people, whose sons we had tried to kill, gave us gifts. Their kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength. The confidence of victors who knew they'd already won not just the war, but the peace that would follow." Böttcher would immigrate to America in 1953, became a citizen in 1958, worked as an engineer for General Motors until retirement. Georg Gärtner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico in September 1945. But instead of fleeing the country, he chose to stay, illegally. He lived under the name Dennis Wiles for 40 years, married an American woman, raised children, worked as a tennis instructor in California. When he finally surrendered in 1985 for a television documentary, he'd been American longer than he'd been German. Reinhold Pabel escaped from a camp in Illinois, not because of mistreatment, because he was bored, because he wanted to see more of this strange country. He lived illegally in Chicago for 7 years, worked in bookstores, married an American woman, finally surrendered voluntarily in 1953. The FBI investigation revealed he'd broken no laws except illegal entry. He received citizenship in 1959, became a successful businessman, later sponsored other German immigrants. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns. Across 500 camps throughout America, German prisoners were discovering something that terrified them more than any battlefield: defeat. They were discovering that everything they'd been told was a lie. Camp Alva in Oklahoma specialized in agricultural training. German POWs managed a 200-acre demonstration farm using American techniques. They learned mechanical cultivation, crop rotation, soil conservation, hybrid seed development, skills they'd carry home to a devastated Germany. The program was so successful that local farmers competed to hire POW work crews, paid premium wages for enemy labor. Camp Concordia in Kansas became famous for its art program. German prisoners created murals that still exist in the Stone County Courthouse. In local buildings throughout the region, the camp orchestra, equipped with donated instruments, performed concerts for civilian audiences. The local newspaper reviewed these concerts favorably, noted the professional quality of enemy musicians. Art created by prisoners now fills Kansas museum collections. Camp Trinidad in Colorado faced brutal winters, temperatures reaching 20 below zero. The Army provided German POWs with Arctic-grade clothing, insulated barracks, increased caloric rations to 4,000 calories daily in winter. A Swiss inspector noted in February 1944 that German prisoners at Trinidad received better winter provisions than Wehrmacht troops on the Eastern Front, according to the prisoners' own admission. But perhaps the most unsettling thing was the information. German prisoners had access to American newspapers that criticized the war effort, revealed production problems, discussed strategic failures. The military deliberately provided diverse news sources, knowing that exposure to a free press would undermine totalitarian thinking more effectively than any propaganda. Radio programs featured commentary critical of military leadership. Comedians like Bob Hope mocked generals and politicians. Journalists like Edward R. Murrow questioned strategies. Congress debated military spending publicly, with dissenting opinions broadcast nationally, all of this accessible to enemy prisoners. The 1944 presidential election campaign seemed like democratic suicide to German military minds. Roosevelt faced a serious challenge from Thomas Dewey. During wartime, Republicans openly criticized war management. Newspapers published opposition views. Political cartoons mocked the commander-in-chief. Yet the war effort continued, even strengthened democracy functioning through apparent chaos. Not despite it. This demonstration fundamentally challenged everything they'd been taught about strong leadership requiring absolute authority. By late 1944, a sophisticated re-education program was underway, though prisoners only knew it as voluntary education. The camp library at Herne grew from 500 books to over 5,000, including works by German authors banned by the Nazis. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, works by Jewish authors that would have meant death to possess in Germany. Sam Houston State Teachers College provided correspondence courses. 340 German POWs enrolled in English, American history, mathematics, agricultural science. Professors visited monthly to conduct lectures and examinations. Prisoners published their own newspaper called Der Spiegel, The Mirror. Early editions from 1943 echoed Nazi propaganda. By late 1944, they featured democratic discussions. The transformation was measurable. Documented Army psychologists identified 3 categories of prisoners: anti-Nazis, about 10%, non-political prisoners, 75%, ardent Nazis, 15%. Each group received different treatment designed to maximize ideological transformation. Anti-Nazi prisoners, identified through careful screening, received additional privileges and education. They became barracks leaders, discussion moderators, newspaper editors. Their influence on non-political prisoners was carefully cultivated. Weekly, reports tracked ideological shifts across the camp population. 1. Major wrote in November 1944, "The transformation rate exceeds expectations. Approximately 60% of non-political prisoners show measurable movement toward democratic ideals." After 6 months of exposure to American society, working in American facilities exposed POWs to casual abundance that seemed like mockery. At the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, workers discarded more aluminum scrap in a day than German aircraft factories could acquire in a week. German POWs were assigned to scrap collection, gave them direct exposure to American industrial waste. Food processing plants provided the deepest psychological shock. At the Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, perfectly edible produce was discarded for minor cosmetic flaws. Tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels, beans with minor blemishes, all destroyed while German civilians starved. One prisoner, Corporal Friedrich Müller, wrote in a letter, "Today we destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit because it didn't meet canning standards. Fruit that would be treasure in Germany is garbage here." The American supervisor apologized to us for the waste. He didn't understand he was apologizing for abundance we couldn't even imagine. The waste wasn't cruelty. It was prosperity so extreme it became incomprehensible. International Red Cross inspections consistently rated American POW camps above Geneva Convention requirements. These neutral assessments provide crucial verification. Inspector Guy Metro wrote in August 1944, "American camps exceed treaty requirements in all categories. Food rations equal or surpass American military rations. Medical care is equivalent to American military hospitals. Educational and recreational opportunities exceed many American military training facilities." Specific findings from Camp Hearn. Caloric intake between 3,300 and 3,800 calories daily. Geneva Convention required 2,000. Living space, 40 square feet per man. Convention required 27 medical staff. One doctor per 500 prisoners. Convention required 1 per 1,000. Another inspector compared American camps to other Allied nations. Having inspected POW facilities in Canada, Britain, and Australia, I can state definitively that American camps provide superior conditions. The distinction is not just material, but philosophical. Americans treat prisoners as temporarily displaced persons rather than enemies. At factories throughout Texas, POWs observed production methods that revolutionized their understanding of industrial efficiency. The Lone Star Steel Plant in Dangerfield produced more in a month than the entire Ruhr Valley before Allied bombing. The secret wasn't just machinery, it was motivation. Workers competed for production bonuses, suggested efficiency improvements, took pride in output. Charts displayed each shift's production like sports scores. Workers wore company pins, bought war bonds with overtime pay, painted bomber names on steel designated for military use. Morale driving productivity, not fear. At railroad yards, the coordination astounded German logistics officers. Trains arrived on precise schedules. Loading equipment operated continuously. Telegraph and telephone systems coordinated nationwide transport. No central planning committee. Just capitalism organizing itself for war production. As Germany collapsed in spring 1945, American authorities prepared prisoners for return to a destroyed homeland. The preparation exceeded simple repatriation. Courses in civil administration prepared POWs for managing destroyed cities. Agricultural training emphasized feeding starving populations. Medical personnel learned public health techniques for epidemic prevention. The military identified potential democratic leaders among prisoners, provided additional training in governance and administration. By May 1945, 31,000 prisoners were enrolled in vocational training, 18,000 studying English, 12,000 in agricultural programs, 8,500 in technical courses, 6,200 in business administration. Future Marshall Plan concepts were explained to prisoners before public announcement. State Department officials visited camps, explaining American intentions to rebuild rather than punish Germany. This incomprehensible generosity from Victor II vanquished shattered final remnants of Nazi ideology about racial struggle and survival of the fittest. The numbers tell the story of transformation of 425,000 German POWs in America. Only 2,200 escape attempts occurred. 0.52%. only 54 successful escapes lasting more than 30 days, 0.01%. Sabotage incidents, 7 confirmed cases, 0.001%. Work refusals, 178 documented incidents, 0.04%. Voluntary labor participation, 87% of eligible prisoners. Post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities found 74% of returned POWs held favorable views of American democracy. 61% supported Marshall Plan aid when announced. 55% advocated for a German-American alliance. 38% expressed desire to immigrate to America. 23% maintained correspondence with American families. 5,000 former POWs legally immigrated to America in the 1950s. 92% became citizens within the eligible timeframe. Their success rate, measured by employment, home ownership, and lack of criminal records, exceeded general immigrant populations. The influence of returned POWs on West German Reconstruction is well documented. 48 became members of the Bundestag. 312 served as mayors or city councilors. 1,847 worked in agricultural modernization. 2,341 taught in reconstituted schools. 4,165 managed businesses using American methods. Hans-Georg von Studnitz, former POW and later German industrialist, told American historians in 1965, "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets operate, how diverse peoples cooperate. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked." Camp Hearn closed in December 1945, but the connections endured. Christmas cards arrived annually for decades. Former prisoners writing to former guards, to families who'd shown them kindness, to a country that had transformed them. The last known prisoner from Camp Hearn died in 2001. The letters stopped, but the legacy remained. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 50 former Camp Hearn POWs returned to Texas. The local newspaper covered the reunion extensively. Former enemies embraced former guards. Wehrmacht veterans placed flowers at the American Legion Memorial. Fritz Zimmermann spoke for the group. "We came as enemies, believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength. That diversity creates rather than weakens unity." The story of German POWs in America represents one of history's most successful transformations. Not through propaganda, not through force, but through simple exposure to reality. They came expecting brutality. They found abundance. They came expecting persecution. They found kindness. They came expecting to be treated as Nazis taught them enemies should be treated. Instead, they were treated like humans, and that humanity, more than any battle, won the peace. The prisoners didn't just witness American power. They experienced American values. They didn't just observe democracy. They participated in it. They didn't just learn about freedom. They lived it, even behind barbed wire. America's greatest victory wasn't on the battlefields of Europe. It was in the prison camps of Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, where enemies became advocates through the simple act of witnessing American reality. The sights that stunned them were unusual only to eyes trained by tyranny. To American eyes, they were just life, messy, imperfect, but free. The German prisoners came expecting to find enemies. Instead, they found mirrors of what they could become. And in that reflection, they saw a future worth fighting for, worth building, worth believing in. Those unusual sights changed individual prisoners, changed the trajectory of nations, laid the foundation for the Atlantic Alliance, for the Marshall Plan, for the democratic reconstruction of Europe. Their transformation proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through reality, not through hatred, but through humanity. The unusual sights German POWs witnessed in America became something far more powerful than military might. They became the foundation for peace. And that peace echoes still